The ballroom shimmered like something out of a dream. Gold-trimmed walls, velvet drapes heavy enough to muffle secrets, and a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear into the stars. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, casting soft pools of light over tables dressed in white linen and dotted with orchids that probably cost more than a week's rent in most neighborhoods. This was the kind of place where people didn't just walk, they glided as if the marble floor might scold them for making too much noise. Waiters moved like shadows, silent and precise, balancing trays of champagne flutes that sparkled almost as much as the guests' jewelry. It was the annual Legacy Gala, hosted by Damien Thorne, the kind of man whose name appeared in headlines more often than in phone books. He'd built an empire out of software and silence, algorithms that knew what you wanted before you did, platforms that turned attention into currency. Tonight he was raising money for arts education, though most of the guests seemed more interested in being seen than in actually supporting anything beyond their own reflections in the mirrored walls. Among the staff was a young woman who stood out not because she tried to, but because she couldn't help it. She moved with a quiet grace, her posture straight but not stiff, her eyes observant without being intrusive. She wore the standard uniform, black slacks, white blouse, name tag pinned neatly, but there was something about the way she held herself, the way her fingers lingered just a second too long on the rim of a glass, that hinted at a different kind of training, not service, something deeper, something older. Her name wasn't on the guest list, but her presence mattered more than most of the names that were. She was here because she needed the overtime. Rent was due. Student loans were piling up like unread letters, and this gala paid double for weekend shifts, especially ones that ran past midnight. So she'd traded her piano bench for a serving tray, her sheet music for order pads, and her concert hall dreams for the hushed clink of silverware on fine china. She'd grown up with music the way others grew up with television or street games. Her earliest memories weren't of cartoons or playgrounds, but of sitting cross-legged on a worn rug in a Harlem apartment that smelled of cinnamon and old paper, watching her grandmother's hands dance across ivory keys. Those hands, wrinkled, strong, sure, could make a piano weep or laugh or roar like a storm rolling in off the Hudson. Her grandmother never called herself a legend. She just called herself a teacher, a mother, a woman who believed music was a language everyone deserved to speak, even if they couldn't afford the dictionary. Now, years later, that same young woman, let's call her Maya, was navigating the minefield of the gala, balancing 3 champagne flutes and a tray of canapes shaped like tiny works of art. She smiled politely when spoken to, nodded when ignored, and kept her eyes down just enough to be respectful, but not so much that she missed a spill or a guest signaling for a refill. She was good at this. Too good, maybe. Because sometimes, when you're too good at pretending, people forget you're a person at all. At one of the side tables, near a potted olive tree that looked suspiciously real, sat an older woman in a simple navy dress. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore small pearl earrings that had seen better decades, but they still gleamed with quiet pride. She wasn't dressed like the other guests in designer gowns and statement necklaces. In fact, more than one server had offered her a menu, or asked if she needed help finding her seat. She'd just smiled and said, "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," and that was that. No one recognized her. Not the socialite who'd once claimed to collect jazz records like rare coins. Not the tech investor who bragged about knowing every major artist personally. They didn't know that the woman sipping water with lemon had once played for Martin Luther King Jr. after a long night of marching. They didn't know she'd turned down a White House performance because the invitation came with conditions she wouldn't accept. They certainly didn't know that the young waitress weaving through the crowd was not only her blood, but also the living echo of her art. Maya glanced over at her grandmother often, checking in with a look, a small nod. Her grandmother always returned it with a calm, steady gaze, the kind that said, "I'm proud of you no matter what room you're in." That look was Maya's anchor. Because tonight, more than most nights, the room felt heavy. Heavy with judgment, with unspoken rules, with the kind of wealth that didn't just buy things but bought the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. The evening wore on. Speeches began. Damien Thorne took the stage, tall and polished in a tuxedo that probably cost more than Maya's monthly income. He spoke smoothly about innovation, about legacy, about how true culture must be protected from dilution. His words sounded noble, but they carried an edge, a subtle message that some voices were worth amplifying more than others. Maya kept serving, but her ears burned. She knew that language. It was the same language used to shut doors in her grandmother's time, just wrapped in newer, shinier packaging. During a lull between courses, Maya found herself near the grand piano at the far end of the ballroom. It was a Steinway, black as midnight, polished to a mirror shine. It sat alone on a small platform, more like a throne than an instrument. No one was playing it. It was just there, for show, like the orchids, like the imported cheese, like the whole evening itself. But to Maya, it wasn't decoration. It was a living thing. She could feel it humming, even in silence. Without thinking, just for a second, she stepped closer. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then, almost as if her hands had a memory of their own, she pressed down softly on middle C. A single, pure note rang out, clear and warm, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a thread of light. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. It was just a breath, a hello. But in a room where every sound was measured, where even laughter was polite and contained, that single note felt like a shout. Heads turned. A few guests frowned. Someone whispered, "Is that staff?" Maya froze, her hand pulling back as if the keys had burned her. She glanced toward her grandmother, who gave the tiniest shake of her head, not in disapproval but in warning. "Be careful." Maya stepped back quickly, smoothing her uniform, forcing her face into neutrality. She picked up her tray and melted back into the flow of servers, heart pounding. She told herself it was nothing. Just a moment of weakness. Just a musician missing her instrument. But deep down she knew. In a place like this, even a single note could be seen as trespassing. Across the room, Damien Thorne had paused mid-sentence. He'd heard it too. His eyes scanned the crowd, then landed on Maya, still in her server's uniform, now retreating toward the kitchen doors. His expression tightened. Not angry exactly, more like disappointed, as if a piece of furniture had spoken out of turn. He didn't say anything then, but his gaze lingered, and in that look was a judgment already made. "You don't belong here." Not like that. Maya felt it like a cold draft down her spine. She kept walking, chin up, back straight, but inside a familiar ache stirred, the one that came from being reminded, again and again, that no matter how much you knew, how much you'd practiced, how deeply you understood the language of music, some people would only ever see your uniform. Her grandmother watched it all unfold from her quiet corner. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her hands resting on the table curled slightly into fists. Not out of fear, out of memory. She'd been in rooms like this before, rooms that smiled while shutting doors, that praised black art while ignoring black artists. She knew the script, and she knew with a certainty that came from decades of living it that this night wasn't over, not by a long shot. For now, though, she waited. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let the other side reveal itself first. The gala continued. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell. The string quartet in the corner played something soft and forgettable. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The air felt charged, like the moment before thunder. Maya returned to her duties, serving dessert with steady hands, though her mind was elsewhere, on the piano, on that single note, on the weight of being seen but not recognized. And somewhere in the back of the room, Damien Thorne made a mental note. He'd address it later, during his closing remarks. He'd make an example of it, gently, of course, for the good of the event, for standards. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn the difference between a lesson and a reckoning. The night wore on, beautiful and brittle, like fine glass held too tightly. And in the quiet spaces between the music and the murmurs, the real story was just beginning to tune its strings. The dessert plates had barely been cleared when the room's mood shifted. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow tightening, the kind you feel in your chest before a storm hits. Damien Thorne stepped back onto the small stage near the piano, microphone in hand, his tuxedo crisp, his smile practiced. He'd just finished accepting a standing ovation for announcing a $10 million donation to preserve classical excellence in underfunded schools. The applause had been warm, generous even, but now he paused, letting the room settle into a hush that felt heavier than silence. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing, not by accident, on the young woman in the server's uniform who'd dared to touch the piano earlier. She was near the back, stacking empty trays with quiet efficiency, trying to disappear into the rhythm of her work. But Thorne wasn't going to let her vanish that easily. "Before we close tonight," he began, voice smooth but edged with something sharper underneath, "I want to say a word about respect." A few guests exchanged glances. Others leaned forward, sensing drama. "Art," he continued, "is sacred. Instruments like this Steinway aren't just objects, they're vessels of history, of discipline, of generations of mastery." He gestured toward the piano as if it were a relic behind glass in a museum. "And while I deeply appreciate the hard work of every staff member here tonight," he gave a polite nod toward the service team, "there's a line between admiration and intrusion." He paused. The room held its breath. Moments ago, someone who is not a performer, not a musician, not even part of tonight's program, felt it was acceptable to place their hands on this instrument, as if it were a toy, as if the years of training, the reverence, the craft behind true artistry meant nothing. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward with quiet force. "Now I understand curiosity, but there's a time and a place. And this," he swept his arm to indicate the grand ballroom, the glittering crowd, the very air thick with privilege, "is not it. This is a space for those who've earned their place through dedication, not convenience." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. All eyes turned. Conversation stopped. Cameras, phones held discreetly under tables, tilted toward the back of the room. The young woman froze, a tray halfway to the kitchen cart. Her face burned, not from anger, but from the sheer weight of being singled out in front of hundreds. She kept her eyes down, jaw clenched, fingers gripping the edge of the tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the floor, to rewind time and never have let her fingers brush that key. Around her, the other servers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. They knew better than to draw attention. In their world, survival meant staying invisible. Speaking up meant losing your job, your references, your chance at next week's shift. So they looked away, busied themselves with napkins or ice buckets, anything to avoid becoming the next target. But not everyone looked away. At the small table near the olive tree, the older woman in the navy dress didn't flinch. She didn't stand up shouting or slam her glass down. She simply sat very still, her expression unreadable. But those who knew her, really knew her, would have seen the fire behind her calm. It wasn't rage. It was something deeper. The quiet fury of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching talent be dismissed because of the color of skin or the cut of a uniform. She watched her granddaughter, her brilliant, disciplined, fiercely kind granddaughter, shrink under the weight of public shame. And something inside her clicked, like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been opened in years. Back on stage, Thorne wrapped up his little lecture with a practiced smile. "Let's remember, excellence requires boundaries, and respect is the foundation of all true culture." He raised his glass. "To legacy." The room echoed with polite applause. Some guests nodded approvingly. Others shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. After all, who was one waitress compared to a man who could write a check large enough to rename a wing of a museum? The young woman finally moved, slipping through the service doors into the kitchen's warm, chaotic hum. The contrast was jarring. Steam, clattering pans, shouted orders, after the icy silence of the ballroom. She leaned against a stainless steel counter, breathing hard, trying to steady herself. A fellow server handed her a glass of water without a word. She nodded her thanks, throat too tight to speak. She wasn't crying, not yet, but the humiliation sat in her chest like a stone. It wasn't just about the piano. It was about being told in front of everyone that she didn't belong, that her hands, trained since childhood, weren't worthy of even a single note in a room full of people who'd never touched an instrument in their lives. What hurt most wasn't the words. It was the assumption behind them, that because she wore a uniform, she had no story, no depth, no right to beauty. Outside the kitchen door, the gala resumed. Laughter returned. Music swelled. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But something had, and the older woman knew it. She stood slowly, smoothing her dress. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. She moved with the same quiet dignity she'd carried through segregation, through being told jazz wasn't real music, through watching record labels take credit for her compositions while paying her pennies. She'd learned long ago that power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply shows up and refuses to be ignored. She walked toward the stage, not with anger in her step, but with purpose. The crowd parted slightly as she passed, some mistaking her for a guest who'd finally decided to mingle, others barely noticing her at all. That was the irony, she thought. They'd spent the whole night celebrating culture, yet couldn't recognize it when it walked right past them, insensible, shoes and a simple dress. She reached the edge of the stage just as Thorne was stepping down, accepting handshakes and murmured praise. He saw her approach and offered a polite, distant smile, the kind reserved for people you don't know but assume are harmless. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Can I help you?" She looked up at him, her eyes clear, steady. "You just shamed my granddaughter," she said, her voice low but carrying, "for touching a piano." A few nearby guests turned. Thorne's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry if it came across that way," he said, already shifting into damage control mode. "It's simply about maintaining standards. We can't have just anyone," she interrupted, not loudly but with a calm that cut through his rehearsed lines. "You called her kitchen staff like it was an insult. Like serving others makes you less human, less worthy of beauty." Thorne blinked. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like they'd wandered in from a different century. "Ma'am, I assure you no offense was intended. It's about context. That piano is part of tonight's artistic presentation. And my granddaughter," she said, cutting him off again, "has played Carnegie Hall. She's composed symphonies that have been performed in 3 countries. She's studying at one of the most respected music schools in the world. But tonight she's working this event because rent doesn't pay itself." A hush began to spread. People nearby stopped talking. Someone lowered their phone. Thorne's confidence wavered. I didn't know that." "No," she said simply. "You didn't ask." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the kitchen doors. "You saw a uniform and assumed a story. But talent doesn't wear a label. And legacy," she paused, letting the word hang, "isn't owned by wealth. It's carried in hands like hers. Hands that know how to serve at and how to create." Now more people were listening. A journalist near the front recognized her voice, the cadence, the quiet authority. Her eyes widened. She nudged her colleague. "Is that—" The older woman didn't wait for confirmation. She walked past Thorne, straight to the piano. The room watched, transfixed, as she lifted the fallboard with hands that trembled only slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of memory. She sat. And then, without fanfare, without announcement, she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note wasn't loud. It was deep, resonant, like a heartbeat waking up after a long sleep. Then another. And another. Soon a melody unfolded. Rich, complex, full of sorrow and strength, like a river carving its way through stone. It wasn't classical. It wasn't jazz exactly. It was something in between, something alive, something that had been born in Harlem, tenements and refined in midnight practice rooms and passed down through generations like a secret. Language. The room didn't just go quiet, it went still. Glasses stopped clinking. Waiters froze mid-step. Even the string quartet in the corner lowered their bows, listening. Thorne stood near the stage, his face pale, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. He'd expected an apology, or maybe a complaint. He hadn't expected this, because now everyone was realizing this woman wasn't just a guest. She was a legend. Whispers started, soft at first, then growing. "That's Evelyn Johnson." "The Evelyn Johnson?" "From the 60s. She played with Coltrane. She wrote Midnight on Lennox. She turned down the Kennedy Center honors twice." The young woman in the kitchen heard the change in the air before she saw it. The usual kitchen noise, sizzling pans, shouted orders, had quieted. Everyone was listening. She peeked through the service door, and there at the piano was her grandmother, playing. Not for fame, not for money, but as a statement. As a reclamation. Tears finally came then, not from shame but from pride so fierce it hurt. She stepped out of the kitchen, unnoticed at first, drawn like a moth to the light of that music. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the woman who taught her that music wasn't just notes on a page. It was resistance. It was joy. It was identity. The piece built slowly, rising like a tide, filling every corner of the ballroom until there was no space left for judgment, only awe. And then, just as the final chord began to fade, the young woman did something unexpected. She walked forward, not with anger, not with defiance, but with love. She climbed the small steps to the piano bench and sat beside her grandmother. Their shoulders touched. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. Then, without a word, their hands found the keys together and they began to play. Not the same piece. Something new. Something woven from both their voices. Her grandmother's deep blues-rooted phrasing meeting her granddaughter's modern, intricate harmonies. It was a conversation across time, across struggle, across love. The room didn't applaud. Not yet. They just stood there, breathless, as two women, one in a server's uniform, one in a simple navy dress, filled the grandest space in the city with a truth no amount of money could buy. You don't earn the right to create by wearing a tuxedo. You earn it by showing up, with your hands, your heart and your story, and sometimes, the most powerful performances happen, not under spotlights, but in the quiet moments after someone tries to tell you you don't belong. Damien Thorne stood at the edge of the stage, forgotten now, his speech reduced to dust in the face of real artistry. He watched not as a CEO, but as a man who'd just been handed a lesson he hadn't known he needed. The music swelled, then softened, then ended on a single shared note, held long enough for everyone to understand. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The last note hung in the air like a held breath, soft, shimmering and full of something words couldn't quite name. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to pause, as if the room itself was trying to understand what had just happened. Then slowly a single pair of hands began to clap. It was the journalist near the front, mid-30s, glasses slightly crooked from leaning forward too eagerly. She didn't clap loudly or dramatically, just steady, respectful, like you would for something sacred. And then another person joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. Not in the polite, automatic ovation that usually followed speeches or scheduled performances, but in something deeper, something that felt like awe, like apology, like awakening. The young woman at the piano kept her eyes on her grandmother's hands. She didn't look up at the crowd, didn't soak in the applause. She just sat there, feeling the warmth of her grandmother's shoulder against hers, the quiet hum of the Steinway still vibrating beneath her fingertips. It wasn't about the standing ovation. It was about the silence that came before it, the silence that meant people were finally listening. Her grandmother turned to her then, eyes glistening but dry, lips curved in the faintest smile. "You played beautifully," she whispered. "You started it," the younger woman replied, voice thick. "No," her grandmother said softly. "I just reminded them who we are." Across the room, Damien Thorne stood frozen, still near the edge of the stage where he'd been left stranded by his own words. His face wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was hollow, like someone had reached inside and pulled out the script he'd been reading from his whole life. And now he didn't know what to say. He watched the two women at the piano, the woman he'd dismissed as kitchen staff and the elder whose presence he hadn't even registered. And for the first time, he saw them. Not as roles, not as background, but as people, as artists, as heirs to something far older and richer than his empire of code and capital. A man in a tailored suit approached him, phone in hand, voice low but urgent. "Damien, your team just called. The video's already online. It's blowing up." Thorne barely heard him. He was still staring at the piano. Back at the instrument, the two women rose together. The younger one smoothed her uniform, not out of shame this time, but out of pride, because she'd worn it while making music that moved a room full of strangers to their feet. Her grandmother adjusted her pearl earrings, then took her granddaughter's hand in hers, fingers laced tight like they used to when the younger one was small and nervous before recitals. They didn't walk off stage like performers. They walked like family, like truth-tellers. And as they passed through the crowd, something remarkable happened. People stepped aside not out of politeness but out of respect. Some reached out gently, not to stop them, but to touch an arm, to say thank you in hushed voices. An older woman with silver hair whispered, "I used to hear you play on the radio when I was a girl," looking at the elder. A young man in a tuxedo, probably a music student himself, bowed his head slightly as they passed. No one asked for autographs. No one demanded selfies. They just let the moment breathe. But outside the ballroom, the world was already moving faster than anyone inside could imagine. In a quiet corner near the bar, the journalist who'd started the applause was already typing furiously on her phone. Her fingers flew over the screen, not crafting a dry news report, but something raw and real. Tonight, at a gala meant to celebrate cultural excellence, a CEO shamed a black waitress for touching a piano. Seconds later, her grandmother, a living legend the room didn't recognize, sat down and played a truth so deep, the entire room fell silent. Then they played together, and in that duet, centuries of erased artistry finally got its due. She hit post. Within minutes, likes poured in. Comments flooded the thread. Who is she? I think that's Evelyn Johnson. Her granddaughter composed Echoes in G. It went viral last year under a pseudonym. This is why we need to stop assuming who belongs in art spaces. By the time dessert was being boxed for guests to take home, the story had a name. Know Your Place, but not the way Thorne had intended. Online, it became a rallying cry. Musicians shared videos of themselves playing in kitchens, on subway platforms, in laundromats, anywhere they'd been told they didn't belong. Teachers posted photos of students practicing on broken keyboards in underfunded schools. And everywhere people asked, why do we only value art when it comes wrapped in privilege? Inside the ballroom, the gala was winding down. Guests lingered, not to network or pose, but to talk, really talk, about what they'd just witnessed. Some admitted they hadn't recognized the elder woman. Others confessed they'd assumed the younger one was just staff and felt ashamed. A few even approached the kitchen doors looking for the servers, wanting to apologize, to thank them, to see them as people. The young woman and her grandmother didn't stay for the aftermath. They slipped out through a side exit into the cool night air. The city hummed around them, taxis honking, distant sirens, the low thrum of life that never really sleeps. They walked a few blocks in silence, arms linked, until they found a quiet bench under a street lamp. I'm sorry you had to do that, the younger one said finally, staring at her hands. I should have just walked away from the piano. Her grandmother shook her head. You didn't do anything wrong. Curiosity isn't disrespect. Love for music isn't trespassing. She paused, then added gently, and you know what? If I hadn't stepped in, someone else would have. Because the truth has a way of rising, even when people try to bury it under fancy words and expensive suits. But now everyone knows, the younger woman said, half worried, half relieved. My music, your name? It's all out there. Good, her grandmother said firmly. Let them know. Let them see that black art isn't something to be discovered like a new trend. It's been here, building, creating, surviving, even when they pretended not to see it. She reached into her small handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, creased from years of handling. She handed it to her granddaughter. What's this? The younger one asked. A letter, her grandmother said, from 1963. I was invited to play at a similar gala. Back then, they called it a salon. The host said I could perform, but only if I entered through the service entrance and didn't mingle with guests. I said no, wrote this letter explaining why. Never sent it. Kept it as a reminder. The younger woman unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, the words firm but kind. Art is not a performance for your comfort. It is a conversation, and I will not speak through a keyhole. She looked up, eyes shining. You kept this all these years? To remind myself that dignity isn't given. It's claimed. And sometimes, she added with a small smile, it's played. Back at the hotel, the cleanup crew was just beginning. Waiters stacked chairs. Florists boxed up wilting orchids. And near the stage, a young stagehand stared at the piano, still feeling the echo of those final chords. He pulled out his phone and recorded a short video of the empty bench, the open piano, the quiet aftermath. He posted it with one line. This is where everything changed tonight. Meanwhile, in his penthouse office downtown, Damien Thorne sat alone, the gala's afterglow long gone. His phone buzzed nonstop. Board members, PR advisors, news outlets. But he ignored them. Instead, he opened a browser and typed in the elder woman's name. What came up stunned him. Grammy Awards. Historic recordings. interviews where she spoke about music as the language of the unseen. He clicked on a black and white video from 1967. There she was, younger, fiercer, playing a piece so full of fire it made his chest ache. The caption read, "Evelyn Johnson refused to play segregated venues. Called music the last honest space." He sat back, stunned. He'd built his career on algorithms that claimed to understand human behavior, yet he hadn't seen the two most human people in the room. His assistant knocked softly on the door. "Sir, the board is requesting an emergency call, and several major donors have withdrawn their pledges." Thorne nodded slowly. "Tell them I'll address it tomorrow." But even as he said it, he knew words wouldn't be enough. Apologies wouldn't fix the damage of assumption. Money couldn't buy back the moment he'd tried to silence a voice that had been singing long before he was born. What he didn't know yet was that the story wasn't ending with shame, it was just beginning to spread. By morning, the video of the piano duet had millions of views. News outlets picked it up, not as gossip but as a cultural moment. Music schools shared it with students. Teachers used it in lessons about bias and belonging, and in living rooms across the country, parents showed their children the clip and said, "See, talent doesn't wear a uniform. It wears courage." The young woman woke up to dozens of messages, not from strangers asking for favors, but from fellow artists. "Your playing gave me chills. Thank you for showing us it's okay to take up space. Can I send you my composition?" For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt seen. Her grandmother, meanwhile, received a call from the Kennedy Center, not to accept an honor this time, but to headline a tribute concert. She declined politely, then called her granddaughter. "They want me to play," she said, chuckling. After all these years of saying no, they finally asked the right way. But the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the invitations. It was in the quiet shift happening in rooms like the one last night, in boardrooms, classrooms, concert halls, where people were starting to question who gets to be called an artist, who gets to touch the piano, who gets to belong, and it all started with one note played by a young woman in a server's uniform, one note that reminded a room full of powerful people that legacy isn't inherited through wealth, it's carried in hands that know how to serve, how to create, and how to rise, quietly, gracefully, and without permission. The silence that followed the duet wasn't empty. It was full of realization, full of regret, full of something shifting deep in the bones of the room. No one clapped right away. No one shouted praise or snapped photos. They just stood there as if the music had left behind a kind of sacred space that words would only ruin. Even the air felt different, lighter somehow. Like a weight had been lifted not from the room, but from the people in it. At the center of it all, the two women remained seated on the piano bench, hands resting lightly on their laps, eyes forward. They didn't look at the crowd. They didn't need to. They could feel it, the change in the air, the way breaths had slowed, the way even the rustle of expensive fabric had stilled. It was the kind of silence that only comes when truth walks in uninvited and refuses to be ignored. Damien Thorne stood near the edge of the stage, his polished shoes rooted to the spot. His speech, so carefully crafted, so full of polished phrases about standards and excellence, now felt like ash in his mouth. He'd meant to draw a line between us and them, between the cultured and the common. But instead he'd drawn a mirror, and in it he saw not a visionary leader, but a man who'd mistaken uniform for worth, who'd assumed that because someone served, they had nothing to offer but service. He watched the elder woman rise first, slow but steady, her posture straight as a metronome. She didn't glare at him. She didn't point or scold. She simply turned and looked at the room, not with anger, but with a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. Then she reached for her granddaughter's hand and helped her up, as if she were still that little girl who used to hide behind the piano during thunderstorms. The younger woman stood, smoothing her uniform blouse. She didn't look ashamed anymore. She looked clear, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and now she could finally set it down. She met Thorne's eyes for just a second, long enough for him to see not resentment but sorrow. Not for herself, for him, for the blindness that had let him speak so carelessly about something he didn't understand. And then, without a word, they walked away. Not dramatically, not with a flourish. Just two women arm in arm, moving through a room that had suddenly grown too small for the truth they carried. But the silence didn't break when they left. If anything, it deepened. A woman near the front, elegant in emerald silk diamond bracelet glinting, turned to her husband and whispered, "I've heard Evelyn Johnson's recordings since I was a child. How did I not recognize her?" Her voice wasn't defensive. It was ashamed. Near the bar, a young man who worked in venture capital stared into his untouched whiskey. He'd invested millions in disruptive music apps, yet he'd never once asked who was writing the algorithms that decided what songs got promoted. Now he wondered, had his own systems been silencing voices like the ones he'd just heard? Even the servers who had stayed near the kitchen doors during the performance now stood a little taller. One of them, a man in his 50s who'd been working events like this for 30 years, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and muttered, "Finally." Someone saw us. Backstage, the stage manager stared at the empty piano, then pulled out his phone. He didn't post a selfie or a behind-the-scenes clip. He recorded a 30-second video of the bench, the open lid, the quiet aftermath. He typed, "This is where dignity sat down and played." He hit send. Within minutes, replies poured in from musicians, teachers, students, people who knew what it meant to be told you didn't belong in a space you loved. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, the city pulsed on, unaware of the quiet earthquake that had just shaken one gilded room. Taxis honked. Street vendors packed up. A saxophonist played softly on a nearby corner, his case open for coins. The two women walked past him, and the elder woman paused, dropped a folded bill into his case, and nodded. He recognized her instantly. His eyes widened, but he didn't stop playing. He just nodded back, and his melody grew a little richer, a little prouder. They found a bench under a flickering street lamp and sat. The younger woman leaned her head on her grandmother's shoulder. Neither spoke for a long time. There was no need. The music had said everything. "You didn't have to do that," the younger one finally said, voice soft. "I did," her grandmother replied. "Not for him, not for them, for you. For every time someone made you feel small for loving something beautiful." "I just touched one key," the younger woman said, almost to herself. "One note. And that's all it takes," her grandmother said. "One note of truth can silence a room full of lies." Inside the ballroom, the spell began to break, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of rushing to leave, guests lingered. They talked, not about stock prices or vacation homes, but about what they'd just witnessed. A woman who ran a music nonprofit pulled out her phone and called her board. "We're changing our outreach. Starting next month, we're going into schools and neighborhoods we've ignored, and we're hiring teachers who look like the kids they're teaching." A man who owned a chain of luxury hotels turned to his head of events and said, "From now on, every gala we host includes a performance by local artists. No auditions, no gatekeeping. If they're making art, they're welcome." Even the string quartet who had stopped playing during the duet gathered near the piano afterward. The cellist ran her fingers over the wood. "I've played here a dozen times," she said quietly, "but I've never heard this room breathe like that." And then there was Thorne. He finally moved, walking slowly to the piano. He didn't sit. He just stood beside it, staring at the keys as if they might bite him. He reached out, hesitated, then pulled his hand back. He didn't deserve to touch it. Not yet. His assistant approached, phone in hand. "Sir, the board is on the line and 3 major donors have already pulled their funding." Thorne nodded. "Tell them I'll call them back. But the press, let them write what they want," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "They're not wrong." He walked to the edge of the stage and looked out at the room, the same room he'd treated like his personal showcase just an hour ago. Now it felt foreign, like he was seeing it for the first time. The gold trim seemed gaudy, the orchids wasteful, the whole evening hollow. He thought about the letter he'd read online that morning, the one from 1963, never sent. "I will not speak through a keyhole." He understood it now. Excellence isn't about exclusivity. It's about access, about making space, not guarding it. Back on the bench under the street lamp, the younger woman pulled out her own phone. She hadn't checked it all night. Now she saw dozens of notifications, not from fans or agents, but from people like her. "A music student in Detroit. Your duet made me cry. I've been told my classical training doesn't fit because I'm black. Thank you for showing me I belong." A teacher in Atlanta. I'm playing this for my students tomorrow. They need to see this. A composer in London. I've been hiding my identity behind a pseudonym too. Maybe it's time to stop. She showed the messages to her grandmother, who read them slowly, her eyes softening with each one. This is why we play, the elder woman said. Not for stages or spotlights. For the ones who need to hear it. The younger woman nodded. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She opened her music folder and changed her artist name from the anonymous alias she'd used to protect herself to her real name. Just like that. No announcement. No fanfare. Just truth. By dawn, the internet had done what it does best. Not just spread the story, but amplified its meaning. Clips of the duet were shared with captions like, "When legacy walks in, even silence bows." Musicians posted side-by-side videos. One of them practicing in a cramped apartment, another performing on a grand stage. Same hands, same heart. Teachers used the moment to start conversations in classrooms. Who decides what art is valuable? And why? And in a small apartment in Harlem, an old upright piano sat in the corner, its keys worn smooth from decades of use. On top of it rested a framed photo. Two women decades apart, both with the same determined glint in their eyes. Below it, a note in careful handwriting. Music is not a privilege. It's a right. Pass it on. Back at the hotel, the cleanup crew finished their work. The last chair was stacked. The last orchid boxed. The grand piano was closed, its lid shut like a secret kept safe. But everyone who passed it paused just for a second, as if it still held the echo of what had happened there. And maybe it did. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions don't come with marches or megaphones. They come with a single note, played by someone the world tried to silence, and answered by a room that finally learned how to listen. Morning came soft and gray over the city, the kind of dawn that feels like a deep breath after a long night. In a quiet apartment above a bakery that still smelled of yesterday's bread, the younger woman sat at her small upright piano, fingers resting lightly on the keys. She hadn't played since the gala, not because she didn't want to, but because she was still feeling the weight of what had happened. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It wasn't even pride. It was something quieter, deeper, responsibility. Her grandmother was in the kitchen, humming as she made tea, the same tune she'd played on the Steinway, but slower, gentler, like a lullaby for the morning. The scent of chamomile and honey filled the air, warm and familiar. Outside, the city stirred. Delivery trucks rumbled, neighbors called greetings from stoops. A child laughed on the sidewalk below. Life went on, but everything felt different now. Her phone buzzed on the piano bench. She glanced at it without picking it up. The screen lit up with notifications, dozens, maybe hundreds. News outlets wanted interviews. Music schools invited her to speak. A major streaming platform offered to feature her compositions under her real name for the first time. She'd spent years hiding behind a pseudonym, afraid that if people knew who she was, if they saw her face, her skin, her story, they'd hear her music differently. Now, that fear felt like a cage she'd outgrown. She finally picked up the phone and opened a message from a high school music teacher in Chicago. My students watched the video. One of them said, "If she can play like that in a server's uniform, maybe I can too, even if I don't have a fancy piano. Thank you for giving them permission to dream." She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and pressed a single key, middle C, the same note that had started it all. It rang clear and steady in the small room, no less beautiful for being ordinary. Across town, in a sleek high-rise office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view worth millions, Damien Thorne sat alone. His desk was clean, his coffee untouched. He hadn't slept. Instead, he'd spent the night reading, really reading about the woman he'd dismissed. He watched old interviews where she spoke about music as the voice of those who've been told to be quiet. He listened to recordings from the 1960s, her fingers dancing across keys with a fire that made his chest ache. He learned that she'd turned down lucrative contracts because the labels wanted to soften her sound, to make it more palatable. She'd refused. "Music isn't candy," she'd once said. "It's medicine. And sometimes it has to taste bitter to heal." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not in a bad way, but in the way you feel when you stand under a starry sky and realize how much you don't know. His assistant knocked softly. "The board meeting starts in an hour. They're expecting a statement." Thorne nodded. "I'll be there." But he wasn't thinking about damage control anymore. He was thinking about repair. By midday, the story had spread far beyond the gala's glittering circle. It wasn't just trending online, it was sparking real conversations. In music departments at universities, professors paused their lectures to show the clip. "This," one said, holding up his phone, "is what happens when we confuse access with merit." In community centers, teens gathered around laptops watching the duet over and over, then heading to the practice rooms to try their own hands at the piano. A young boy in Baltimore, who'd been told his neighborhood didn't produce real musicians, recorded himself playing a simple melody on a keyboard his aunt had bought from a thrift store. He posted it with the caption, "I touched the keys. No one stopped me. Know your place." Within hours, musicians from around the world replied with encouragement, tips, even offers to send sheet music. Meanwhile, the elder woman received a call from a museum curator. "We'd like to include your story in our new exhibit on unsung American artists," she said. "Not just your music, your resistance, your refusal to be invisible." The elder woman thought for a moment, then said, "Only if my granddaughter is included too, and if we can feature other artists like us, people who created beauty while the world looked away." "Absolutely," the curator replied, voice thick with emotion. "That's the whole point." Back in the apartment, the younger woman finally agreed to her first interview, not with a glossy magazine, but with a small, independent podcast run by two music students. They didn't ask about fame or fashion. They asked, "What does it feel like to be told you don't belong in a space you love and then prove them wrong with your hands?" She took a breath. "It doesn't feel like proving anything," she said quietly. "It feels like coming home, like finally being seen for who you really are, not what you wear, not what you serve, but what you create." Her grandmother sat nearby sipping tea, listening with a small smile. Later that afternoon, the two of them walked to a nearby community center. They hadn't planned to go anywhere, but a message had come through. A group of kids in a youth music program had asked if they'd visit. Just to say hello, maybe play a little. They arrived to find a room full of children, some with violins, some with beat-up keyboards, some just clapping along to rhythms they made up on the spot. When the two women walked in, the room fell silent, not out of fear, but out of awe. The elder woman didn't say much. She just sat at the old piano in the corner, its keys chipped, its wood scratched, and began to play. Not a grand piece, just a simple melody, warm and inviting like an open door. The younger woman joined in on a second keyboard, weaving harmonies around her grandmother's tune. And slowly the kids began to play too, adding drums, humming, tapping desks. Soon the whole room was making music together, not perfectly, but joyfully. Afterward, a girl no older than 10 tugged on the younger woman's sleeve. "Did they really say you couldn't touch the piano?" she asked, eyes wide. "They did," the younger woman said gently. "But you did it anyway." "I did." "Good," the girl said firmly, "because music belongs to everyone." Those words stayed with her all the way home. That evening, Thorne stood before his board of directors, not in a tailored suit, but in a simple blazer. No tie. He didn't bring slides or statistics. He brought honesty. "I made a mistake," he began, voice steady. "I assumed that because someone was serving, they had nothing to offer but service. I confused role with worth. And in doing so, I insulted not just two extraordinary artists, but the very idea of art itself." He paused. The room was silent. "I can't undo what I said, but I can change what I do next. Starting today, our foundation will redirect all gala funds to music programs in underserved communities. We'll partner with schools that lack instruments, teachers, even basic supplies. And we'll ensure those programs are led by artists who reflect the students they serve, not by outsiders who think they know what those kids need." One board member cleared his throat. "That's a significant shift in strategy." "It's the right one," Thorne said, "because excellence isn't something you preserve behind glass. It's something you grow in soil that's been ignored for too long." He didn't mention redemption. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply laid out a plan, Not to fix his image, but to fix the harm. Later that night, the younger woman sat down at her piano again. This time she didn't play someone else's music. She began to write her own. A new piece born from the silence, the shame, the strength. She called it One Note. It started soft, hesitant, like a question. Then it grew, layer by layer, until it filled the room with a sound that was both tender and unbreakable. Her grandmother listened from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes closed. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes and said, "That one's for the ones who are still waiting to be heard." "Yes," the younger woman said. "It is." And in that moment, they both knew. The story wasn't ending. It was just finding its next verse. The night of the concert arrived, not with fanfare, but with a quiet kind of electricity, the kind that hums in the air before something true is about to happen. Carnegie Hall glowed under the city lights, its grand arches and stone columns standing like sentinels of history. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood, old velvet, and anticipation. The program for the evening was simple. For the ones who play in the shadows. No flashy titles. No celebrity cameos. Just music offered as a gift.